Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. A'udhu billahi minash shaitani rajim. As-salatu wa salam ala Rasulillah. Assalamu alaikum, brothers and sisters, and I'd like to welcome you to the Emmoa Foundation's lecture on the basics of Islamic psychology. Islamic psychology is a field that has been growing in interest over the last few years. It is based on the Quran and Sunnah and concepts that talk about the nature of man in a holistic manner. We can ask ourselves, what is the nature of man? This is man's fitra state. What is fitra? Fitra is the state of purity and innocence that Muslims believe all human beings are born with. Fitra is an Arabic word that is usually translated as original disposition, natural constitution, or innate nature. According to Islamic theology, human beings are born with an innate inclination towards tawheed, oneness, which is encapsulated in the fitra, along with compassion, intelligence, ihsan, spiritual excellence, and other attributes that embody the concept of humanity. This provides us with the compass when one's soul is out of sync with Islamic guidance based on the Quran and Sunnah, also known as the Sharia, or the environment is out of sync with the Sharia, and this has upset the soul. The primary objective is to bring the individual back in touch with their fitra state and to bring them closer to their creator, Allah. There are various elements that need to be taken into account in the process of analyzing one's alignment with the fitra. In order to take us on this journey today, to understand the basics of Islamic psychology, we have with us Seyed Jamaluddin Miri. Seyed Jamaluddin Miri is the director and co-founder of ISIP, International Students of Islamic Psychology. He is a licensed counselor from Sweden with a postgraduate diploma in Islamic psychology from Cambridge Muslim College. You are very welcome, Brother Jamaluddin. The floor is yours.
Jazakallah khairan, Sister Aziza. It's an honor to be with all of you. Thank you for the great introduction and settling of what we are going to discuss today, inshallah, with regards to psychology from Islamic perspective. So thank you so much to the whole Emmoa Foundation for inviting me. Such an honor to be with all of you, and you guys are doing such an amazing work in the Ghanaian context. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant all of you tawfiq. I want to thank Sister Aziza and the rest of the team at Emmoa for the excellent work and for inviting me. Such an honor to be with all of you. I want to thank all participants, dear excellent brothers and sisters, for joining us today. I hope that this lecture will be a benefit for all of you, inshallah. So let me just share my screen, inshallah. Bismillah. And then I'll start. Just 1 second, dear brothers and sisters. All right. Hope you guys can see my screen. So, Bismillah wa alhamdulillah wa salawat wa salam ala Rasulullah wa alihi wa sahbihi wa min wala. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Dear brothers and sisters, participants, colleagues, esteemed students of knowledge, an honor to be with all of you. Sister Aziza so eloquently introduced the whole concept of what we're going to speak today about. The whole lecture will be an introduction to Islamic psychology and understanding the basics and the foundations of Islamic psychology, inshallah. Briefly about myself, I think Sister Aziza introduced me very eloquently. So as Sister Aziza said, I'm one of the co-founders and director of ISIP, the International Students of Islamic Psychology. And we're going to speak a little bit about ISIP today as well, because we're together with Sister Aziza and her team establishing our Ghanaian chapter. So it will be an honor if you would like to join us if you're interested in Islamic psychology and Muslim mental health. Also, to connect it to ISIP, we have a research center that we're establishing called the Al-Balkhi Institute of Islamic Psychological Studies and Research. And I'm also part of the Shifa Institute in Sweden and Scandinavia, where we're trying to establish a holistic center for Muslim mental health and Islamic psychology for the Scandinavian Muslim context. Also, I'm part of the Futuwa Nasheed Academy of Islamic Arts, and I'm a licensed counselor, studied social psychology and industrial and organizational psychology previously, currently doing a master's in clinical psychology as well, postgraduate in Islamic psychology from Cambridge Muslim College, and I'm also trained in TIIP, traditionally Islamically integrated psychotherapy, from Khalil Center and Ibn Khaldun University, US and Turkey. So this is briefly about myself. Now, what is Islamic psychology, dear brothers and sisters? And feel free to share your questions and reflections in the chat, and we will address them after my lecture, inshallah. So, As Sister Aziza alluded to, Islamic psychology finds its roots in the Quranic worldview and prophetic example as embodied by our beloved Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Islamic psychology at its core is looking at the human being in a holistic manner and examines and approaches human behavior, motivations, emotions, and healing through an Islamic lens. So Islamic psychology centers as well, the whole centers its utilization connected to the concept of fitra. And fitra, as I'm sure you guys know, we're born into fitra, a pure disposition of knowing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through his divine names and attributes. And it's the soul's connection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the whole aspect of healing is to bring back human being to be in touch with his or her fitra, where we could find true well-being. And the metaphysical components of the ruh, soul, aql, mind, nafs, which could be translated in different ways, but yeah, we could call it lower self, and qalb, the metaphysical heart, are the key components of influence and study within the discipline of Islamic psychology and ilm al-nafs. And as Sister Aziza also alluded to, it's all rooted in our primary sources in Islam, which is the Quran and the Sunnah. Now, we also work with the secondary sources, which is, for example, the works of our traditional scholars. And I will allude to the traditional scholars later in my presentation, inshallah, because their works are very important. It's very important, dear brothers and sisters, to know that psychology from Islamic perspective is nothing new. We've been studying the soul for over 1,000 years within Islamic thought. So this is really nothing new. The way we conceptualize it today might be a little bit different than what they did historically, but nevertheless, the science of the soul, psychology, from Islamic perspective has been part of our tradition for over 1,000 years. So a lot of scholars traditionally have done a lot of research and even empirical studies when it comes to psychology, which interventions could be beneficial in, dealing with, trauma, dealing with depression, anxiety, melancholy, etc. So there is a lot of rich tradition that we can utilize. Hence, contemporary studies in Islamic psychology, of course, first and foremost, rooted in primary sources of Islam, but also we utilize the works of the secondary sources, for instance, works of our traditional scholars. And by the way, at the research center in ISIP, the International Students of Islamic Psychology, we call it Al-Balkhi Institute. So Abu Zayd Al-Balkhi, which we have, we named our research center after, he was actually the father of what we today call CBT, cognitive behavior therapy. And I'm sure many of you who are mental health professionals or interested in psychology, I'm sure you guys know what CBT, cognitive behavior therapy is, right? So if you read the dictionaries of psychology here in West, or the lexicons of psychology, or when you read articles or books about the history of psychology, they tend to be very Eurocentric, and they diminish contributions of scholars from other traditions, including the Islamic tradition, into the field of psychology. So you will never read, or I shouldn't say never, but it will be quite rare to find contributions from Abu Zayd al-Balkhi in the lexicons and the encyclopedias of psychology and Western curriculums, unfortunately. So we as Muslims, we need to actually normalize and introduce what we have brought into the field of psychology. Now, there's different approaches in how to work with psychology from an Islamic perspective. So there is, for instance, both top-down approaches and bottom-up approaches, right? So one way of working with psychology from Islamic perspective is what we call Islamization of psychology, all right? And that is to filter Western psychology from an Islamic lens, all right? So for instance, we study, let's say, modern psychology like cognitive behavior therapy or acceptance and commitment therapy, and then we try to filter it by comparing to the Islamic, epistemology and paradigm, and things that are not applicable to our Islamic paradigm, we refrain from utilizing, and things that are applicable, we can utilize. So this is essentially Islamization of psychology. And that's one approach of working with Islamic psychology. The second approach is what we call Islamic psychology, or ilm al-nafs, which is directly rooted in the Islamic paradigm. So it's an indigenous approach and a bottom-up approach towards psychology, rooted in the Islamic paradigm, and the Islamic epistemology, and in the Quran and the Sunnah, the primary sources, right? And the secondary sources. So we study the works of the traditional scholars and utilize it in working with clients or doing research or studies. This is more a bottom-up approach, an indigenous approach towards psychology from an Islamic paradigm. Then we also have the comparison model, which is to compare Islamic notions with other notions as well. There is a lot of equivalent approaches with other traditions. There is not, I mean, sometimes we have this default of refraining from engaging with other traditions, but we should be quite curious, dear brothers and sisters. Actually, our traditional scholars, they were very curious about, knowledge from other traditions as well. Because as we have heard from the prophetic hadith that, wisdom is the lost property of the believer, they took that hadith, they embody it, and they adhere to curiosity when it came to engaging, studying other traditions as well, and their thoughts, their knowledge base, etc. And of course, they were so rooted in the primary sources of Islam and the Quran and the Sunnah, so they knew how to refrain from things that are not congruent or applicable to the Islamic paradigm, but then they actually utilized things that were applicable and congruent to the Islamic paradigm. And that's something you'll see as you start your journey in studying Islamic psychology, that a lot of the traditional scholars, they also engage with Greek thought, Persian thought, Indian thought, traditional Chinese medicine, etc., as sources where they could find perhaps things that could be applicable to Islamic paradigm. Also, according to the prophetic hadith of wisdom is the lost property of the believer, wherever he finds it, he can use it, right? So when we speak about comparison model, it's not to say that Islamic psychology is not unique, because it is, but there is things in other traditions that we can utilize that is very congruent to the Islamic paradigm as well. So these are some of approaches and how we can approach Islamic psychology. Now, speaking about IOK, Islamization of knowledge, which is the top-down approach, according to Ismail Raji al-Faruqi, rahimullah, Islamization of knowledge is to recast the whole legacy of human knowledge from the standpoint of Islam. So al-Faruqi is one of the leading scholars and established the whole aspect of Islamization of knowledge. And he spoke about 7 steps of Islamization of knowledge and how we could Islamicize knowledge. And step 1 is creation of understanding and awareness. So we need to be understanding our own tradition and awareness of other traditions as well. And then crystallization of Islamic thought, concepts, and methodology. So we need to be rooted in Islamic thought, Islamic concepts, and methodology of how we could do, for instance, research, studies, etc. The third step, according to al-Faruqi, is to have mastery of the legacy. And this is the legacy of our own tradition. We need to know more about our tradition. For instance, if we want to engage in Islamic psychology, we need to know about our tradition when it comes to ilm al-nafs, the science of the soul, the science of psychology within Islamic thought. The fourth step is mastery of contemporary knowledge. So our traditional scholars, they were very much in touch with contemporary knowledge of their time. And during their time, Greek thought was the contemporary mainstream knowledge, right? Today, it's more what we find in Western academia, right? That's the contemporary knowledge that is normative. So it's good for us, even though we're critical to many notions in Western thought and Western psychology, that we have mastery of contemporary knowledge. And then we need to establish textbooks and disciplines. And then we need to prioritize scientific research. And finally, we need to have preparation of academic cadres, scholarships, training grants, etc. And when we have this mastery of our own legacy plus contemporary knowledge, then we could Islamicize. How could we use CBT within an Islamic framework? How could we use, for instance, psychodynamic therapy within an Islamic framework? By having mastery of our own knowledge and knowledge base and construct, and of course, mastery of contemporary knowledge, in this case, let's say CBT, then it's easier to Islamicize and utilize that in a congruent way according to the Islamic paradigm. Another excellent scholar, Professor Naqib al-Atas, with regards to contemporary knowledge, he also spoke about IOK, Islamization of knowledge, as the deliverance of knowledge from its interpretation based on secular ideology and from meanings and expressions of the secular. So he had two steps model of how we could engage in IOK, Islamization of knowledge. The step one, according to Al-Atas, is isolation process, where knowledge should be freed from Western culture and civilization. So we isolate some of the constructs that we want to utilize and that is congruent, perhaps. We isolate it and try to free it from its roots, whether it's rooted in Western culture, civilization, or other traditions as well. The second step is that after the isolation process, those existing body of knowledge should be infused with Islamic elements. So this is how he gave us nasiha and how we could work with Islamization of knowledge or even Islamization of psychology. Feel free, dear excellent brothers and sisters and colleagues, to write your questions in the chat and we will address them later in this session, inshallah. An honor to be with all of you. So Professor Najati, he is also one of the leading scholars in modern time. And you can call him actually one of the fathers of Islamic psychology, together with Professor Malik Badri, rahimahullah. I'm going to speak about Professor Badri later in my presentation, dear brothers and sisters. Professor Najati, he was a scholar, if I'm not mistaken, born in Sudan, but Egyptian originally. He believed that a critical step in building Islamic psychology as a discipline lay in a deep knowledge of the Islamic intellectual heritage. To have a deep knowledge, according to Professor Najati, served 6 important functions. So this is his 6 steps of how we could establish a framework for Islamic psychology. The first step, dear excellent brothers and sisters and participants, when we work with Islamic psychology, we need to understand that this is nothing new, which I mentioned in the beginning of my presentation, right? And when we are rooted in that notion, then that notion will allow us to understand that Islamic psychology scholars, they have worked a lot with this field, and we can utilize and draw upon contribution that spans the course of 15 centuries. Sometimes in modernity, and this is something that I tell myself every day as a way of being self-critical, you know, that we tend to think that we are the modern ones, we know best. You know, we are a part of modernity, we have access to so much knowledge. And this generation, modernity is very much nafsani. It's a very nafsani approach towards knowledge, toward life. With nafsani, I mean very much inclined to our, lower self, almost like a narcissistic way, if we want to use Western terminologies. We tend to reject sometimes the traditional contributions. And this is indirectly an effect of modernity in Muslim psyche as well. Because if you look at modern scholarship, and specifically the secular scholarship and how West looks at history, tradition, it's very detached from tradition. Because often in Western thought, we speak about tradition, specifically in secular and liberal circles, as something backward, something non-modern, something that we shouldn't engage with. They didn't know, we know better. This is very nafsani. This is very nafsani, right? We as Muslims, we don't agree on this. That's why we have the Sunnah as one of our primary sources, which is the prophetic tradition. We believe in tradition. The way that we engage with knowledge is to root ourselves in our tradition, right? So we're actually the opposite. We believe that first and foremost, you need to root in your tradition. Then, of course, you need to tackle contemporary issues as well. We're not against development, of course, but we need to be rooted in our tradition. So by understanding that we can draw upon contribution that spans over 15th century, we understand that we need to root ourselves in our tradition when we want to engage in establishing a contemporary notion of Islamic psychology. So the second step, according to Professor Najati, is it bridges. When we speak about Islamic psychology and root ourselves in the tradition, it bridges a historical gap frequently found in the writings of modern psychology historians who tend to bypass the Islamic civilization. As I mentioned before, dear excellent brothers and sisters, if you read, for instance, the Oxford Encyclopedia of Psychology, I give that as an example. I can almost reassure you guys that you won't find a lot of contribution from Muslim scholars. This is a leftover from the colonial era. And of course, all of you who are from West Africa, you know, you experience. There's somebody who has their microphone.
Please, can everybody mute apart from Seyed Jamaluddin? Thank you.
Thank you, Sister Aziza. So please, if you could be muted, I would really appreciate, even though I would love to hear your voices, by the way. So inshallah, there will be time for that. But you guys are from Ghana, most of you are from West Africa, right? So you experience colonialism, first and foremost, most severe than all of us. And so you know the effects of colonialism. And of course, most of Muslim lands were colonialized by the Europeans and the Western countries. And colonialism was not only exploiting our bodies, right? A lot of West Africans were enslaved, right? In the transatlantic slave trade. And a lot of us were also enslaved mentally, colonized mentally and psychologically. And in that sense, we tend to ourselves bypass our own tradition. And one of the strategies that the European powers used was to detach us as Muslims from our history, from our ontology, you know, from our epistemology. And actually, Professor Ramon Grossvogel, which is one of the leading decolonial scholars in the world, he speaks about the epistemicide, that what colonialism did to Muslim thought and Muslim minds were an epistemicide, which is an epistemological genocide, eradicating our tradition, our epistemology, our notions of reality. When you detach human beings from their history and rooted tradition, then it's easier to exploit them and make them run your errands. That is the divide and conquer mentality that many colonial powers used. So in order for us to reestablish a notion of Islamic psychology, we need to root ourselves in our tradition. And one aspect of working with Islamic psychology is actually to decolonialize our minds. I'm actually very interested in decolonial psychology as well, and I work a lot with that field as well. So inshallah, in the future, we could have a lecture. I'm happy to share more thoughts about decolonial psychology. I'm not going to be too much focused on that today, but nevertheless, when we reroot ourselves in our tradition and decolonialize our mind, that's the way to then connect ourselves to Islamic psychology as well. And mentally decolonialize ourselves is the first route into then reorganize ourselves and reconnect ourselves to a psychology from an Islamic perspective. So that's the mentality the Eurocentric notions used. They bypassed our tradition. We need to bridge the historical gap again. The third step, according to Professor Najati, when you establish and work with Islamic psychology, it builds upon psychological knowledge that was produced by Muslim scholars and Muslim communities. This is very important, dear brothers and sisters. There is something within modern psychology today that I'm quite interested in, actually, and I think it's good. It's called religious sensitive approach or culturally sensitive approach towards psychology and mental health. What does that mean? It means that when you're working with certain groups or certain communities or certain ethnic minorities, for example, here in West, if let's say, a non-Muslim counselor is working with a Muslim client, he or she needs to be mindful of the Muslim client's religious and cultural heritage in order to provide the best possible mental health support. If you're not rooted, then you can easily perhaps use an intervention or a type of language that could make the client feel not comfortable. For instance, the Muslim culture is more collectivistic. So when you speak with a Muslim about mental health, you can't just speak about it from an individual point of view. You need to also bring about the family or the society, right? Or another, culturally sensitive approach could be that some notions within Western psychology is very sexualized. And we as Muslims, our tradition, our religion is more a religion of having haya, to be, very much mindful of not speaking about certain things, to put some boundaries. We don't speak publicly about, things that are intimate. And that's something you need to be mindful of as a counselor when you work with Muslim patients. This is called religious or cultural sensitive approach. And our Muslim scholars, what they established when it came to Islamic psychology was rooted in the Muslim context as well. So Islamic psychology could even be a benefit for non-Muslims to understand that these are constructs could be a benefit to address Muslim mental health. Even non-Muslims could benefit from a normalization of Islamic psychology as a way of working with a religious or culturally sensitive approach. It also exemplifies approaches exerted by Muslim scholars to reconcile Islamically driven knowledge and knowledge acquired from other cultures and traditions. So when you're rooted in your own tradition, it could make you more comfortable in studying knowledge that is acquired from other traditions and cultures as well. You know, Islamic thought, one of the important aspects of our traditional scholars' work, they were curious in their nature. We could call the Islamic culture a culture of curiosity. Curiosity comes from being rooted in your own identity. Because when you're rooted in your own identity, dear brothers and sisters, then you feel safe in your own identity. And then you do not need to become reactionary. And what do I mean with reactionary? I mean, when you're not rooted in your own tradition, then it's easy that you become reactionary. The modern man is very reactionary because a lot of us, you know, including myself, we're not fully rooted in our own tradition because we're detached, right? In many ways. So then you become reactionary, which means that you either refrain from all knowledge that doesn't come from the Islamic paradigm or is not indigenous knowledge, or you just assimilate everything, you know, becoming a token for other traditions and other ideologies like secularism, for instance. While our traditional scholars, they were neither tokens or they neither refrained from engaging from other traditions as well. They were in the middle. Why? And what is middle? It's balance, which is essential for Islamic psychology and Islam as a whole. The religion of mizan, balance, moderation, right? We need to be moderate. So our scholars, traditional scholars, were very moderate. They neither assimilated as a token fully, or they rejected fully. They rejected things that were not applicable to Islamic paradigm, and they integrated things that were applicable. So they had this balanced approach because they were rooted. And that's why we need to be rooted, because then we can reconcile, as what Professor Najati says, knowledge from our tradition and also acquired knowledge from other cultures and traditions as well. The fifth step is when you root yourself in Islamic psychology, it allows for the development of a holistic understanding of human beings. So Islamic psychology is a holistic discipline, dear brothers and sisters. And what do we mean with holistic? Holistic comes from the word whole in English. And etymologically, etymology is the science of the history of words. The history of words. So the word whole in the English vocabulary etymologically means, the word health, which is connected to holistic, in the English vocabulary means whole. To be healthy, you need to be whole, holistic. What do we mean holistic? That when you speak about health, you need to have a holistic approach. You need to connect both the dunyavi health and the ukhravi health. You need to both connect the horizontal health, which is to work with the nafs and work with your, behavior inclinations and work with your cognitions and your aql, but also with the verticality, which is your connection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to work with your ruh, to support your connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the whole aspect of Islamic psychology is a holistic understanding of human beings and human well-being. And the final step is that all the Islamic psychology complements the psychological truth derived from the Quran and the Sunnah, the primary sources of Islam. Now, this is a conceptualization, dear brothers and sisters, of how we can view Islamic psychology. This is Dr. Rothman's conceptualization of IP from his scholarly work. And Dr. Rothman, I had the honor to study with him, and he's also part of ISIP's advisory board. So this is his conceptualization, dear brothers and sisters. And what we can see in this model is essentially what we are studying in Islamic psychology, right? First and foremost, as I mentioned in the first slides, we look at particularly four components, but we can add also other components as well, which is the nafs, the lower self, the qalb, the metaphysical heart, the aql, also our intellect and cognitions, and the ruh, the soul. And we try to bring about an understanding of how we can create and establish balance between these faculties. Also our emotions could be added there, our ihsas as well. All right. The balance comes through the metaphysical heart, which is the center of well-being. And connected to the metaphysical heart, the ruh resides there, which is our soul. And our soul is our wasila, our connector to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? And by bringing about health here, you establish a relationship for the client or for yourself with your fitra, which is your natural tendency and your natural disposition, your original disposition towards tawheed, towards the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the knowledge of oneness, and the knowledge of the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through his divine names and attributes. Fitra. Fitra we can also use the word fitra to speak about fitri lifestyle, which is an Islamic healthy lifestyle, to be connected to an organic lifestyle, where you live according to the Sunnah, according to the Sharia, according to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's will, is to live a fitri lifestyle, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has told us how we should live a healthy lifestyle where we are connected to our fitra, connected to Tawheed and the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we try to bring about that type of fitri lifestyle as a component and utilizing interventions that could further facilitate this for our clients, but also in our studies, how can we reconnect ourselves to fitr? How can we reconnect? Because when we are growing up in the society, dear brothers and sisters, as we grow up, through socialization, we get less connected. We become less connected with fitra. A lot of layers of socialization blurs our connection and our vision and our connection with fitra. And the whole trajectory from all mankind is to reconnect ourselves to fitra. How do we do that? By different interventions, by different spiritual practices, and by adhering to the Sharia, by adhering to the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That's a way to break socialization bonds that are detaching ourselves from fitra and then re-establishing our connection to fitra once more. All right. So these are the four components. We try to work with an ukhravi approach and a dunyavi approach to make it easier for you while you're in dunya as well. Now, if you're governed, if you have balance in your constitution and you're connected to your, and you're very much aware of the connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through your ruh, then you are in a state of fitra almost, you feel your fitra, you're connected with your fitra. If you're not, and you're governed by your nafs, your lower self, then you could start to be in a state of hafla and not being mindful of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in a state of hafla, and that's where shaitan's waswas comes in. Shaitan often comes with his waswas where you're not balanced, when you're not living a balanced life according to the Sharia, when you're in a state of depression, for instance, or then it's easy for shaitan to utilize that you're not in balance to take you astray, to bring you to another path that takes you astray from the path towards Allah Azza wa Jal, right? Which you see in the lower section of the model. And then the whole aspect of how the traditional scholars try to understand the soul, the nature of the soul, the structure of the soul, was to study these components, right? For instance, working with the nafs. The nafs has different structures. So you have, for instance, nafs al-amara bil-su, which is the nafs that is inclined to evil. That is the lower level of our nafs, all right? The whole trajectory of bringing you into connection to fitra is to work with your nafs, right? Through different spiritual practices like jihad al-nafs, fighting your nafs, or taskiyat al-nafs, purifying your nafs. That's some of the spiritual practices that our traditional scholars advocated for you to work with your nafs and elevate it from a state of nafs al-amara to nafs al-mutmainna, which is the serene soul, the serene self, which is connected to fitra, connected to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, mindful of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, governed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's will. Now, nafs al-lawama is the reproachable self. Nafs al-lawama is very important, and we need to strengthen it. Nafs al-amara is kind of like the teacher who says to the student, you shouldn't do this. This thing that you're doing will take you astray from the way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants you to live. So the reproachable self, nafs al-lawama, try to enforce on nafs al-amara, which is the nafs that is inclined to evil, how this level of nafs should engage with things that could make us go astray, and instead choose ways or actions or behaviors that is in congruence with the Islamic paradigm. So nafs al-lawama is important to strengthen if it's weak. Now, if the nafs al-lawama is too strong, is too judgmental, it could actually destroy the nafs. And that's not good either. It should be strong, but it should also be mindful and sometimes flexible, all right, dynamic. Because if it's too strong, then it will destroy the nafs. And when we speak about jihad al-nafs, fighting the nafs, we don't mean to destroy the nafs, because everything that Allah Azza wa Jal has given us, dear brothers and sisters, has a benefit. Believe it or not, everything has a benefit. It's all about moderation. If we speak about our emotions, even anger, dear brothers and sisters, has a benefit. We think sometimes that anger is not good. And it's true. If it's not moderated, if it's not purified, if it's not rectified, it's not beneficial. It's not beneficial. If it's just raw anger could be very destructive, right? Now, if you have a nafs al-lawama that is too strong and crushes your nafs and crushes your anger, then you become weak. You can almost become a coward. You know what I'm saying? For instance, I'm a brother, right? So all brothers, for instance, but even sisters, of course. Let's say somebody comes into my house and wants to rob my family, all right? If my nafs al-lawama has broken my nafs and my anger, and it destroyed it, then I become a coward. I will go up into my bathroom and I will lock the door and I will not protect my family. That's not good. So too little anger becomes cowardness. Too much anger becomes fury, like a volcano who just erupts. Balanced anger, moderated anger becomes courageous, courage. And courage is a virtue in Islam. So we should always be mindful when we speak about health, well-being, and Islamic psychology, that it's not about taking away nafs or other components, it's about moderation. And through purification of your nafs and jihad al-nafs, you can work with your nafs so that it comes to the level of nafs al-mutmainna, the serene self, the serene soul. On the other side, on the left side of this picture, dear brothers and sisters, of this model, for instance, you find the notion of tahdib al-akhlaq. Tahdib al-akhlaq means refinement of character. That's also something that we could utilize in order to bring a person into a state of health and balance, right? So, for instance, muhlikat means vices, munjiat means virtues. So the traditional scholars, through different practices, gave us recipes of how we can take away vices and add virtues into our character development. Okay? I mentioned, for instance, a vice is to be coward, a virtue is to be courageous. So they gave us a lot of interventions and modalities and how we could work with this. Refinement of character, tahdib al-akhlaq. So when we work with, for instance, elevating our nafs and purifying our nafs, we're working both with our metaphysical heart, but also in a sense, we're working with our aql and we're working with our nafs as well. The same comes with tahdib al-akhlaq, which works with the qalb, mainly the metaphysical heart, but it also utilizes intervention to take away aspects of the lower self and elevate it and connect us to our soul once more by adding virtues into our character traits, for instance. Okay. Now, also what this model is conceptualizing, dear brothers and sisters, is which type of disciplines contributed to the development and to the study and the science of the soul in Islam, Islamic psychology. We can look at the tasawwuf tradition, the spiritual tradition of Islam, as a tradition where scholars from the tasawwuf discipline studied, for instance, how to work with the metaphysical heart, qalb, how to purify your qalb, your metaphysical heart, for instance. You also had scholars from the fiqh tradition, from the Islamic jurisprudence tradition, who tried to bring about studies of how we can further work with our aql to establish, to set our aql in a state of health, for instance. The akhlaq tradition, which is the Islamic ethical tradition, they work a lot with character development and how we could work with taking away vices and adding virtues, which is something that could benefit our psychological well-being. So, and the Kalam tradition, which is applied, theology, they worked in their studies of psychology and understanding Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, understanding our fitrah, and trying to study it from the Kalam tradition, for instance. So all these disciplines contributed to the development of Islamic psychology. All right, let's go to the next slide. So now it's important to understand, dear brothers and sisters, that Islamic psychology is an interdisciplinary science in its nature. As I mentioned, it's rooted in the Quran and the Sunnah, but all the disciplines that contributed to the studies and the development of Islamic psychology, they wanted to understand the reality and the structure of the soul and how to bring mankind into a state of well-being. They all wanted to understand the Sunnah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's laws, systems, and structures in all of creation and the concept of our soul. And as I mentioned before, that the prophetic tradition also encouraged scientific endeavor. As stated, the Prophet ﷺ said, the word of wisdom is the lost property of the believer. Wherever he finds it, he is most deserving of it. So this hadith and the prophetic tradition created cohesion amongst a wide range of specialists when they tried to study the science of the soul. In contrast to Western psychology, actually, where different schools are in odds with one another, often, not always, but often. For instance, behaviorism is in odds with psychoanalysis. This was not the case in Islamic psychology. Whether the scholar were studying psychology from the tasawwuf tradition, or the kalam tradition, or the fiqh tradition, or the tib tradition, the Islamic medical tradition, or the akhlaq tradition, they were all working with each other, not in odds with one another. When Islamic scholars refuted each other's theories, they did it with husnul dhan, having positive thinking in one another. Hence, they were not involved in character assassination or were dismissive of their opponent's work. Rather, they engaged in what we today call, the brothers and sisters, peer review and fact-checking, which is a common routine in contemporary scholarly work. So actually, what we see today as a default in academia, we as Muslims established it, peer review, to fact-check each other's articles or scholarly work. This is something that was established traditionally by Muslim scholars. Scholars in sciences, dear brothers and sisters, and scientific fields that contributed to the field of Islamic psychology historically were, for example, from the philosophical discipline, we had scholars like Al-Kindi and Ibn Sina who contributed to the study of the soul. From child psychology, we had Al-Tabari. From cognitive therapies, Abu Zayd al-Balkhi. Medicine and tib, Al-Razi and Ibn Sina. Psychotherapy, Al-Razi. Sociology, Al-Farabi. Social psychology, Al-Farabi. Akhlaq and Islamic etiquettes, Ibn Miskawayh. Tasawwuf, Ibn Arabi and Imam Ghazali. Aqidah, Imam Ghazali. So all these sciences, all these disciplines contributed to the development of Islamic psychologies, including all these excellent scholars as well. So we had a lot of scholars working with child psychology, social psychology. I forgot to even mention Ibn Khaldun, even though we don't connect him directly to psychology, he is a sociologist, right? So we need to understand that our traditional scholars were curious beyond just being rooted in one discipline. And all of them were polymaths. They were encyclopedic scholars. So they were trained and they were, working in many different disciplines, not only in one discipline. And this is something that we should revive from our tradition. To be polymath is something good. To be rooted and have knowledge in different disciplines allow you, when you do research or clinical work, to derive to conclusion by comparing different knowledge constructs from different disciplines, which makes it easier for you to work interdisciplinary. Now, let's focus on some of the sciences that contributed to the development of Islamic psychology, dear excellent brothers and sisters. As I mentioned previously, tasawwuf, spirituality, fiqh, jurisprudence, tib, medicine, and akhlaq, ethics, are some of the disciplines that helped to shape what came to be known as the discipline of ilm al-nafs, psychology, study of the soul. But Islamic psychology as conceptualization of the human being could be found in all of the Islamic sciences. So let's look at fiqh and how fiqh contributed, for instance. So fiqh and sharia were important in the creation of ilm al-nafs because they deal with the divine law. And this is a branch of the science that is, one branch of the science that is becoming more developed in recent era as well is the maqasid al-sharia, the overarching aims of the divine law, the objectives of the divine law, as described by Imam al-Ghazali and previously also by Imam Shatibi. What is the objectives of Islamic law? And there is 5 components to that. One is protection of religion, deen, life, health, property, and dignity. Specifically, the 2 objectives of protection of health and religion are important to our psychological well-being. Fiqh is also concerned with the human actions as they relate to the divine judgments, sharia. Fiqh is important because the rules of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can only be recognized through the prescriptions or judgments outlined in fiqh jurisprudence. How do we perform our ibadah? What shall we refrain from? From an Islamic psychological point of view, it is imperative to know what is right, good, and wrong, bad, when it comes to rulings concerning human actions. So that's why fiqh was important in the development of the study of the soul. Now, let's go to next tradition that also contributed to the development of Islamic psychology, which is tasawwuf. Tasawwuf was important in the creation of ilm al-nafs because it deals with the sincere intention and turning towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. By doing so, we could do tazkiyat al-nafs, purification of the self, of the soul. Tazkiyat al-nafs is the process of purification, and it's attributed to a person's perfecting their intentions and actions by doing things in addition to the minimum requirements. Tasawwuf in itself is a process of realizing ethical and spiritual ideals. In order to be successful in this process, you need to know what constitutes your soul, which type of diseases deviates your path towards Allah Azza wa Jal, how to find moderation and equilibrium, and how to bring yourself into a state of normality. Imam Ghazali, for example, believed that closeness to God is equivalent to normality, whereas this distance from God leads to abnormality. Imam Ghazali, one of the great scholars within the science of tasawwuf, listed some of the spiritual diseases, for example, such as fame, status, self-centeredness, lust, ignorance, envy, etc. He also detailed a therapeutic model of its opposites to break the grip of these evil traits and bring the person back to equilibrium. For example, deal with ignorance with learning, deal with self-centeredness with khidmah and servitude and service. Imam Ghazali's view on disease, where they could be categorized in 2 categories, was physical and spiritual. He saw some diseases as physical and some as spiritual. Even though he was not a physician, because he was not a physician, I should say, he focused more on the spiritual diseases. And in his Ihya ul-Madin, the revival of the religious sciences, he was stating that he will let the physicians deal with the physical components as those are not part of his realm. Now, this is very important, dear brothers and sisters. If we look at modern psychology or modern medicine, they only focus on the physical ailments, mostly. Of course, there are some modalities that are not doing that, but mostly, if I generalize. While what Imam Ghazali says is that we need to look at health and diseases both from a physical component a headache, but also spiritual component. Maybe this headache is because you're not close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you know, or you're in a state of hafla. So this is the beauty of Islamic psychology. We look both at the physical and the spiritual, So the third field that has, contributed to the development of Islamic psychology is tibb, medicine. So tibb medicine as a field did also provide significantly to the field of ilm al-nafs. For example, Abu Zayd al-Balkhi, al-Razi, and Ibn Sina, they came from the medical field. Al-Balkhi, for example, he stressed the fact that you could never disconnect the psychological from the physical, and was criticizing the colleagues of his era in his manuscripts for not putting enough time in analyzing the psychological state of the patient and how that affects his or her illness. This criticism is very valid for this contemporary era as well, dear excellent brothers and sisters and participants, because a lot of the Western medicine that is also normalized in non-Western countries is very allopathic. And what do I mean by allopathic? Allopathic medicine means just remove, just do surgery and remove. It's not to understand the root of the symptom and what has caused the symptom. What Abu Zayd al-Balkhi says is that you need to put time on the psychological state as well, and not only the physical state, which is also something Imam Ghazali said. Imam Ghazali even criticized, colleagues of his time, psychologists of his time. He told them, for instance, that a lot of psychologists of his time, they only look at, for example, melancholy, somebody's melancholic, and they prescribe him or her medicine. Maybe the melancholy, according to Imam Ghazali, is something good for the patient because that will make him or her less attached to dunya. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is facilitating this so that he or she will become less attached to dunya so that they can be more attached to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And dear brothers and sisters, I'm sure all of you have been through trials in life. Trials and tribulation is part of life. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He has said that He will test us. He will test us, right? So trials and tribulation is part of life. At least from my own experience, dear brothers and sisters, and also in many of my clients' experience, because I work as a counselor and I have a lot of clients, I can see that if you can handle that trial and tribulation in a way where you can cope with it, and sometimes you need professional help to cope with it. If you're in a severe trauma, then you should seek help from a counselor like myself, or a psychiatrist, or a psychotherapist, or a clinical psychologist. That is very important. Or even or a sheikh, or an imam who could help you spiritually. Yes, seek help, and we will be at your service as mental health professionals. But nevertheless, what I learned from my own experience and my clients' experience as well, when you support them, after a while, if you can cope with it, that trial or tribulation in your life could become a blessing. And it is a blessing. In the beginning, we don't understand the blessing. It's a blessing in disguise. But as we decipher it, we will understand the blessing. Many times when we go through trials, after a while, if we use sabr, if we have patience, and we have shukr, gratefulness towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we will see the wisdom and hikmah in this trial. And many times we come closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Honestly, dear brothers and sisters, I have always felt most close to Allah, or not always, but many times, when I'm in a state of, perhaps unbalance, or, even, we can use words like depression, because sometimes when we just live life, we take things for granted, right? We take things for granted. But then when it's taken away from you, for instance, you become sick, then you cannot take your health for granted. And then you understand, oh, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, I'm so sorry that I was in a state of hafla. I should always be thankful and mindful that you're the provider of health. And I should always be grateful for that. Then you become grateful, you come closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that breaks being in a state of hafla. Because subconsciously, sometimes we can be in that state. And I'm not, bypassing anybody or myself. This is just the reality. Unfortunately, but it is a reality for many people, And that's what Imam Ghazali says, that maybe that melancholy could be a blessing for you, because then you can come closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Doesn't mean that we should not treat melancholy or depression or trauma. We should, but we should also understand that this could be a mean for the patient to come closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala if it's dealt in the proper way. All right, the fourth discipline that contributed to the development of the field of Islamic psychology is the akhlaq tradition, Islamic ethics. So akhlaq, etiquette, and for example, as I mentioned before, tahdib al-akhlaq, refinement of character, was important in the creation of ilm al-nafs because it focuses on the reformation or refinement of our character, which help us to purify our metaphysical heart, our qalb, which in turn is the major component of our soul. Tahdib al-akhlaq, however, is specifically also concerned with redirecting blameworthy character traits and adopting praiseworthy ones. How to erase, as I mentioned before, vices and replace them with virtues. The concept of morality preached by, for instance, Ibn Miskawayh, which is was one of the leading scholars in the akhlaq tradition, was closely related to the problems with the soul. So, muhlikat and munjiyat. Muhlikat, vices, munjiyat, virtues. So in the Islamic tradition, we always focused on development of a good character. You can find it in the hadith where the Prophet ﷺ has said that he has come to, I have only come to perfect character, right? So our scholars in the akhlaq tradition, they worked a lot with listing what is vices, what is virtues, and how to add virtues and refrain from vices and delete vices from your character. So vices could be lying, envy, arrogance, conceit, anger, lust. Virtues could be honesty, humility, chastity, God consciousness. All the virtues brings you into a state of health. The vices makes you go astray. Then we have the notion of takhliya and tahliya. Takhliya is to rid oneself and work on eliminating the things that are haram and makruh. Tahliya is to adorn or take on those beautifying things from the prophetic example and traits. So in the akhlaq methodology, dear brothers and sisters, it is to work, you need to work first with takhliya, to rid oneself from bad traits, and then tahliya, to adorn and beautify yourself and your character traits. In fact, the command to rid ourselves of negative characteristic is not something arbitrary, not at all. As our noble Prophet ﷺ emphasizes in numerous hadith, the encouragement to engage in getting rid from bad character traits, taking away these bad character traits. No one with an atom's worth of arrogance will enter paradise. The heaviest thing on the scales on the day of judgment will be good character, husn al-khuluq. These are all prophetic statements. Now, let's look at modern psychology, dear brothers and sisters, and its perspective to understand what differentiates modern psychology with Islamic psychology and where we can find the common denominators as well. Modern psychology today, not all of the modalities are very much affected by rationalist ideas, that reason and intellect is the only source of knowledge, all right? So your reason and your intellect is your only source of knowledge, and in a sense, your only source of health. Now, this is a very extreme notion. Not all modern psychology adheres to this notion anymore, but nevertheless, it is rooted in its, it's rooted in a lot of the constructs in modern psychology. It's also very mechanical. Man as machine. As I mentioned, allopathic medicine speaks about removing and doing surgery. Okay, you have a problem with your back, let's do surgery. You have problems with your hands, let's do surgery. It's not about understanding the cause of this disease, whether it's a physical disease or a psychological disease. So it views man as a machine. Also, it's rooted in scientism. And scientism is an ideology which states that only the empirical counts. Empirical is things that you can see, things that you can do, empirical studies about. Everything else, such as the metaphysical, is rejected. And this is very interesting, dear brothers and sisters. If you look at the etymological definition of what psychology means, psyche means from the Greek, it comes from the Greek word of soul. Psyche means soul in Greek, subhanAllah. And logi means science in Greek. So historically, psychology was the science of the soul, which is the case in Islamic psychology and ilm al-nafs. But with modernity and with the development of ideologies such as rationalism and scientism, the whole aspect of the soul became detached from psychology. So today, in many ways, psychology is the science of the nafs and the aql, of the behavior inclination and of the cognitions, right? CBT, cognitive behavior therapy. And we're not against that, by the way, as Muslims. We do believe in CBT. It could be very beneficial. Abu Zayd al-Balkhi spoke about CBT in his manuscripts 1,000 years ago, but not to only focus on this. And that's where Islamic psychology comes in. We believe in the metaphysical realities as well, and that it's important to bring them about when you work with healing, when you work with psychology or psychotherapy. René Descartes, the father of rationalism as an ideology and philosophy, he famously said, "I think, therefore I am." Essentially, he's putting the whole construction of human being in the mind. If I think, that, therefore I exist. That's not the Islamic notion. We exist because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created us. That's how we believe in our reality. This whole idea of I think, therefore I am, created the Cartesian dualism, which has also affected modern psychology, which is to separate the intellect, the body, and the soul, detaching the intellect, the body, and the soul from one another. So in modern psychology, distinguishing intellect and body and dismissing the soul completely. Contrary to what I mentioned before, the etymological Greek basis, psyche means soul, logos means studies or doctrine. Modern psychology is also quite reductionistic. The part as autonomous versus the part as part of a larger whole. Many interventions and theories are only looking at the part, while we, from an Islamic psychological framework, dear brothers and sisters, we believe that the part is part of a larger whole. That's why Islamic psychology is very holistic. Also, as I mentioned before, modern psychology and also modern medicine is very allopathic, biomedical, to treat symptoms and diseases with medication or surgery. Often here in Sweden, if you go to, let's say, to the doctors, if you even go, often you're prescribed with medication for your depression and trauma. Often. As the only means. Now, we as Muslims, we're not against medication. Sometimes it's important with medication. We're not against medication. Actually, many of our traditional scholars, including Ibn Sina, rahimullah, they developed medication for different diseases. Back then, they used a lot of herbs, right? That was the medication of that era, Nevertheless, we're not against medication, but not only as the only tool to be utilized. That's the problem with allopathic medicine. They only utilize medication or surgery. This is not the Islamic notion, the Islamic psychological notion. Sometimes you need medication, but you need to also provide other intervention, like, for instance, therapy, like connecting yourself to your spiritual heart, your metaphysical heart, to work with that, to bring about another meaning of your disease, etc. So modern psychology and medicine is very allopathic, unfortunately. It's also very nafsani, behavioral. For instance, animal behavior can explain human behavior. A lot of the studies in behaviorism, they studied on rats and other, creatures, and then they tried to take that knowledge and apply it on human beings. That's very reductionistic. We're not rats. How can you take a rat's reality and add that to a human being's psychological reality? So it's very reductionistic and it's very behavioral. Only what can be controlled is worth studying. So what you can control, that's what you can study. The things that you cannot control, things that are intangible, like the soul, like your dreams, should not be studied or incorporated into explanations of human behavior, motivations, or development. There is a caveat here and a disclaimer. Not all modern psychology adheres to this principle. There are a lot of great modalities in modern psychology, including positive psychology, third wave CBT, that are actually very holistic. Even though they're not fully tawhidi, they're still quite holistic. All right. So this isn't just a generalization. Doesn't mean that all modern psychologists like this, but nevertheless, it's very behavioral. So we shouldn't look at things that are not tangible at all, which is quite problematic. It is problematic. I shouldn't say quite problematic. It's very problematic. Also, psychoanalysis has also affected modern psychology, which states that man is governed by desire and lust. Man is actually born quite lust-driven. desire-driven, almost like we're born evil, or we're born with sin, which is the Judeo-Christian notion. This has affected us in modern psychology. Man is governed by desire and lust. We don't believe in that as Muslims. We're not governed by desire and lust. We have desires and lust, and we should rectify and moderate them so that it's balanced according to the will of Allah, according to Sharia. Nevertheless, we're not governed by it. We're not governed by it. We're born pure. We're born in a state of fitra, actually. It's a very positive view of human reality that Islamic psychology provides. So to summarize, dear brothers and sisters, modern psychology is a reaction to the Judeo-Christian narrative, all right, that you're born with sin, for instance. That's the narrative. So it's a reaction. That's why a lot of the psychology movements in the 17th, 18th century refrained from spirituality, because the Judeo-Christian notions that was governing during the medieval time in Europe was very much viewing human beings from a very non-fitri way. You know, you shouldn't be connected to your emotions at all. If you're living a virtuous life, you should live in celibacy. In Islam, we don't believe in celibacy. The virtuous people in Islam, they were all married. They had wives, they had children. All of the Anbiya, all of the prophets, they were married. You know, if we take the prophetic example, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the prophet had children, he was married. So to be a virtuous person in Islam doesn't mean that you should reject from being married, from your desires. You should keep the desires according to Sharia. Then it's actually a virtue. It's an ibadah even to be married. Actually, we know that 50% of our religion comes from marriage. That's 50% of our religion, right? So the Judeo-Christian narrative and notions which were non-fitri, right? They actually catapulted the modern psychology's view on spirituality, which is quite, unfortunately, negative, all right? Also, what modern psychology through psychoanalysis preached was that you are the vicegerent by your desires. While we believe that we are vicegerents, but we are representing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We're his Khalifa. He is the one who is the ruler. We're just his servants. That's the view we have as Muslims when it comes to being a vicegerent. Also, the aspect of original sin made Western psychology, modern psychology, being quite negative towards spirituality. You can see it in Freud's work. He's very anti-religion because he viewed religion as something that only evokes sin. This is not the Islamic way. If Freud had studied Islam, I'm sure he will not be critical of spirituality in the way that he was, because he came from a Judeo-Christian tradition which advocated that people are born into sin. While we believe that fitra as being an important, we don't believe in that. We believe in fitra. They believe that fitra is connected to sin. We don't believe in that. Fitra for us is to be born in the pure state of Tawheed. And also the Judeo-Christian notions of medieval time. It doesn't mean that all Judeo-Christian notions are equivalent to this. In the medieval time, had an unnatural morality. They dismissed the natural human disposition. So modern psychology came as a reaction, hence its anti-spiritual approach, because they thought at least spirituality was connected to the Judeo-Christian notions, those who developed modern psychology in the 17th and 18th century. Now, let me just bring about some thoughts of how we can work with top-down and integrative approach when it comes to dealing with Western psychology, because not everything in Western psychology, for your excellent brothers and sisters, is negative, it's bad. There are a lot of good things in modern psychology that we could utilize from a top-down approach, which I was mentioning before my presentation, Islamization of knowledge. That's great approaches that we can utilize as well when we speak about, for instance, Islamic psychology, and an integrative approach as well. For instance, Freud, even though a lot of things from Freud and his theories is not applicable to the Islamic paradigm, he has said some things that make sense. For instance, he spoke about the metaphor of the engine and the steam. For instance, he spoke that a person could be looked at as a machine, all right, in the sense that we have an engine, okay? He was alluding to this old school trains that they had during the 18th century, which was fueled by coal. It was not electric trains. it was cold trains, and they had like a chimney, and they had steam that needed to be released from the chimney in order for the engine to work properly, right? So he was speaking about our emotions and our, our character traits, and he used the metaphor of engine and steam, which means, for instance, that we're like an engine. Our desires or our emotions are the steam. If we don't have a chimney that could release the steam from the engine, then the whole engine will explode, according to Freud. So let me reiterate myself. If we don't have a proper chimney and a release function that could release the steam, which is our emotions, let's say, or desires, from the engine, then the engine will explode. He was speaking about a lot of the psychosomatic diseases that he was encountering with his patients in Vienna, which was, for instance, they had problems with their, body, they had headaches, etc., came from that these patients didn't have proper chimneys that could facilitate the release of their steam, emotions, from their engine. So the engine, which is their body, exploded, and that's why they have psychosomatic diseases. This is quite interesting, and it could be very applicable to Islamic paradigm, because we do believe that we need a chimney and we need to release it as well. So we need to have proper avenues of releasing our, God-given emotions or desires, of course. And if we don't do it, then we can explode. But the difference between Freud and Islamic paradigm is that while Freud believed to just release it, do whatever you want, he didn't believe in, the type of morality that we as Muslims believed in. We have our chimney governed by Sharia and akhlaq, Islamic ethics. That's how we could ventilate our steam from our engine. So we need to ventilate our natural God-given emotions and, desires, if we want to use that word, but it needs to be governed and released, ventilated from the chimney, the steam, through proper moral and ethics, according to the Sharia and the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's what differentiates the Freudian view and the Islamic view. But there is some commonality that we do believe that we need a chimney, but our chimney is governed by Sharia. There's other modalities in modern psychology, like ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy, that's part of, excuse me, brothers and sisters, that is part of what we call the third wave CBT, third wave cognitive behavior therapy, which is actually very much open to spirituality as well. Even though it's a little bit secularized notions of spirituality, they're still quite open to it, and it's very applicable to Islamic paradigm. To accommodate and accept, not flee one's tribulation. All right. So let's say you're in a situation where you're going through trials in life. Instead of denying it or shutting it down or, dismiss it, you accept it. This is part of acceptance and commitment therapy. Accept your trial instead of fleeing it. Because if you don't accept it and you just try to fight it, it becomes bigger actually. Rather than accepting it, well, you deal with it by being with it. And with time, you will develop coping mechanism that will make this trial less severe and less central in your life. All right? This is very much in line with our Islamic view of qadr Allah, predestination, and sabr, patience. That things are written for us. We cannot fight it. This is what Allah wants. If I'm going through a tribulation, it's because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants that for me right now. But if we just have sabr and acceptance, then with time the hikmah will come, it will become less severe, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the shafi, He's the healer. So with time, healing will come, but not perhaps in the way that you think it will come. It's the acceptance of qadr Allah. It's quite congruent actually with acceptance commitment therapy. And there's a lot of research about how we can use ACT from an Islamic paradigm. And even humanistic psychology, positive psychology, acknowledges some notions of transcendence, but does not take out of the realm of the nafs. So even though in humanistic psychology, Abraham Maslow, one of the leading figures and scholars in humanistic psychology, he spoke about transcendence. It's still not transcendence towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's transcendence from the nafs, but not towards something higher, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because they still didn't believe in that Tawheedi approach. So it was still to feel good rather than to be feeling God, or to be good rather than being with God. So they spoke about good with a small g, while we speak about God with a capital G. Nevertheless, there are some components in humanistic psychology and positive psychology that is very congruent with the Islamic paradigm. Brothers and sisters, I think I'm over time, so I'm going to now end my presentation so that you guys could ask questions, and I'm at your service. This is just me comparing from a top-down approach and an integrative approach, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is one of his fundamental contributions to humanistic psychology, with the Islamic notion. And look at it, dear brothers and sisters, just briefly, and this will be my last slide. On the left, you see Maslow's hierarchy of needs. He speaks about the first needs that human beings need to reach in order to feel health is physiological needs, and then safety needs, and then belonging and love needs, which is also connected to the psychological needs, and esteem needs. And finally, self-actualization and self-fulfillment needs. But when he speaks about self-actualization, he speaks about achieving one's full potential. But what is one's full potential? It doesn't define that our fullest potential is to come closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we as Muslims, if you look at the chart on the right side of the slide, we could adhere to all these steps and hierarchy of needs, but we add the self-transcendence part, which is orienting goals and motivation beyond the self. Maslow is still in the realm of the nafs, the self, while Islamic psychology wants to take you beyond the self, beyond the nafs. All right, dear brothers and sisters, there are some other parts of my presentation where I speak about how we can utilize the comparison model to work with Islamic psychology. I also speak about how we can use the indigenous approach to understand Islamic psychology. This model defines how we can look at Islamic psychotherapy, where Western psychotherapy mainly focuses on nafs, the behavior inclination, and the aql, the cognitive aspects dealing with health, while we as advocates of Islamic psychology and psychotherapy, we also focus beyond the realm of aql and nafs. We go beneath the iceberg seen on the surface level, and we try to also re-establish connection with the qalb and the ruh, which is to look at the spiritual states as well. So the bottom-up approach, as I mentioned, founded in our Islamic paradigm, primary, secondary sources, and cumulative work that we build upon works from our traditional scholars. Yes, this will be my final slide. I'm mindful that I'm over time. So yeah, let me stop sharing my screen. I hope that you guys benefited from my introduction. I had maybe 6-7 more slides, but I'm mindful of the time. Please forgive me for going over time. Please forgive me for any shortcomings in my presentation. If I said anything wrong or presented anything wrong, my sincere apologies. I'm just a student of knowledge like all of you. And if anything good came from my presentation, it's from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and all the mistakes are solid in mine. It's an honor to be with all of you, and I'm looking forward to share more information about ISIP as well. But first, let's take questions from my presentation. Thank you so much for listening. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Jazakallah khair, Brother Jamaluddin. Thank you so much for a very, very enlightening presentation. It was very interesting, and I've been scribbling away. There's quite a few questions in the chats. Before we start the questions, I would just like to, just kind of summarize a little bit what you've been talking about in terms of the Islamization of psychology, and then looking at the actual Islamic psychology, i.e. rooted in Islamic theory itself, and then the comparison model, which will probably come up in the questions as well, looking at how people can adopt the two. I've seen a question that alludes to that, so that inshallah we'll have a chance to expand on that also. The first question I would like to launch the Q&A session with is this. Looking at the framework for Islamic psychology and psychotherapy, could we go back to that slide, the Abdullah Rothman slide, which has the framework, i.e. the anatomy of Islamic psychology? I think one of the...
Let me see if I can go back, sister, just 1 second.
Okay.
I have some problems with my computer right now. Let me see here.
No worries. Okay.
You see my screen, or?
I see your screen. Yeah, I see your screen. It's the framework one with the akhirah at the top and the dunya at the bottom, and over different components of with the framework for Islamic.
Just 1 second, sister. Yes, okay. Let's go back.
Okay.
I'm sorry,
No
it's one of the first slides, so
no problem. Take your time. Take your time. I think whilst we're clicking through the slides, I'll just ask the question for somebody who goes in for it. This is the slide. Yes, alhamdulillah. Thank you so much. For somebody who goes in for a session with an Islamic psychologist, could you just enlighten us on how this framework would translate into the process of diagnosis during the session with an Islamic psychologist? So you know, how would this translate? I mean, what kinds of, you know, questions and issues? This is just out of curiosity. So I think a lot of people are used to the Western secular psychological approach, you know, if they go to a session and the kinds of questions that are asked. But now this is a more holistic approach with, you know, other layers. You know, we're looking at the qalb, we're looking at the ruh, we're looking at the nafs, and there's this anatomy as well. Can you just give us an insight into how that session would be conducted that would be different to a Western psychological session?
I mean, first and foremost, there are different approaches in Islamic psychology as well. It's not a monolithic way. I mean, there are different approaches, but it's rooted in the same, you know, construct, the same, you know, view of both bringing health in a horizontal way, but also in a vertical way. So generally, what differentiates Islamic psychology from Western approaches, and we need to be mindful that not all Western approaches are the same as well, right? Sorry. That we try to also look at your spiritual component. For instance, you know, your relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is very important when you try to assess a person's well-being. Or, you know, are you living a fitri lifestyle or not, you know? We also try to assess that and look at that and, you know, engage. And the way that you engage the metaphysical components, let's say, the qalb, it's not something tangible per se, like this is how you engage your qalb. It's about being mindful and being present of understanding that health is beyond just what we see. It's also being. If you see that a client, for instance, is not just able to be in the moment, then you can see there is something there that we might need to be strengthening from a spiritual intervention. The spiritual interventions can look differently. Spiritual interventions could be to, you know, remind, you know, our clients about certain ayat or certain dhikrs, or, you know, doing tawbah as a way of releasing this shame you have, to, you know, evoke Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's divine name and attributes and try to reflect upon, you know, the divine names. Like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most forgiving, the most compassionate. And when you find a client who is very, or she is very hard towards themselves, you can actually bring about the spiritual component of Rahmah as one of the divine names, right? And how can you internalize that Rahmah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for instance? And that caters to your, you know, ruhani aspect of your health, and also your qalbani aspect of the health. Also to be mindful that when we speak about aql, in modernity, we tend to in default connect aql with your head. But actually, our body has an aql. Our heart has an aql. So our aql is not only connected here in the head. So when we speak about aql, sometimes try to listen and see the client's aql of his mind. Sorry, a body, for instance. How is his aql of his body? How can I see that? It could be by how he's sitting, how he's living his life or her life, you know, and to be mindful of that. So that don't just add aql as something cognitive that you have in your head. Try to always assess aql as part of all of your constitutions and faculties. Also, when we speak about lower self, we believe in a higher self as well. Like if you look at psychoanalysis in West, they only speak about the lower self almost, all right? I'm actually trained in psychoanalysis. I studied in psychodynamic therapy. Almost, always focus on the lower self. We believe in a higher self. We believe in this potentiality, right? But it's not an arbitrary process, Sister Aziza. You need to utilize the Sharia sometimes, or often actually, but do it in a compassionate way. I meet a lot of clients that are very much in a state of hafla, but they don't want to be in a state of hafla. They have a lot of addiction behaviors that brings them into a state of hafla, but they want to reach the fullest potential. If I just shame them and I tell them, you're doing haram, you're evil, let's say, it will not help them. Actually, what helps them sometimes is to be compassionate and tell them Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is compassionate. This is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's way of testing you. This is your trial. So use tawbah. When you relapse in your addiction behavior, use tawbah, repent, and try your best to not do it again. And don't use tawbah as a way of justifying your actions and thinking that I can do this haram and then I do tawbah and it's all good. No. But as long as you're fighting and trying your best, and sometimes you relapse, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will see your intention, inshallah, and use tawbah. That is your, safeguarding, tool that you have in your toolbox. So you utilize these ruhani approaches as a way of bringing that person into a state of health. Now, when we speak about addiction from an Islamic paradigm, we can view it differently than perhaps Western approaches. What is addiction? Addiction could be a maladaptive way of coping with trauma. A maladaptive way of coping with trauma, and it could be essentially the biggest trauma for all Muslims is when we lose our knowledge and our experience of being in a state of fitrah, because we're all born into fitrah. And the first wound that we feel as Muslims and as people who come into dunya is the loss of the experience of fitrah. A child is screaming, right? Because he or she is wounded from the loss of this pure love, to be embraced by Tawheed, only being in a state of Tawheed, not knowing anything else than Tawheed. Then you come into dunya, the first loss, the primary wound is the loss of that, subconscious experience we had. It was not a conscious experience, it was a subconscious experience in a sense, because you were only in that state. You cannot compare that with anything else, right? Then with socialization in dunya, you get less and less detached. The first coping mechanism of that loss is your mom, because your mom gives you a lot, right? A child screams, mom comes and gives you food, it gives you love. But after a while, the child will see that mom is not perfect, because the only perfect love we can find is the love of Allah. That's perfect. Everything else are imperfect. Now, the love of mom is not good enough after a while, so then you start to attach yourself to other mortal objects. And with time, if you not cater this child's growth in a spiritual way, then it could go to addiction as well. Addiction is actually a maladaptive way of coping with that loss in many ways. You can look at it like that. Actually, there is a very well-known Western psychologist. His name is Gabor Mate. He's a very good scholar. He's a Canadian psychologist or psychiatrist. He works a lot with addiction. He speaks about people that tend to have drug addiction. When they take that drug, they feel like the hug of a mother, or like you're being embraced of love. And it's a maladaptive way. So what we as counselors trained in Islamic psychology could do is to do psychoeducation, trying to make the client understand the whole notion of fitrah and the attachment from fitrah, and that this addiction behavior that they have is actually a maladaptive way, that it's not beneficial on the long term, but then instead trying to understand why are they using this maladaptive coping mechanism, because they're longing for that primary love, to be reconnected to fitrah, and then we can help them by guiding them towards that. Of course, in the end, what differentiates an Islamic psychologist with a Western psychologist is that we're not the healers. We're just the tools. We're just the vessels that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses for the healing trajectory of the client. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the healer. That's very important, because even the therapist can have a nafs. And sometimes you can think, I am the one who is causing this change in the client. No, you're just the tool. You're just the vessel of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that brings the therapist into a state of balance. That's why all the things, all the interventions that we are propagating towards our clients, we as therapists need to internalize and utilize as well. We need to do tazkiyat al-nafs. We need to be part of our spiritual wayfaring as well. We need to be part of that path as well. So there's a lot of things I can say connected to your question, Sister Aziza, but just briefly, what I think that I summarized, and I hope that the message was clear, is that we are not focusing only on the horizontal aspect of our health. We're also adding the ukhrawi aspect of your health. We're also being mindful of the client's ukhrawi health. So if you're engaging in something that could hurt your ukhrawi health, and it might also hurt your dunyavi health, we're trying to balance this both. We're thinking on both realms. And that's the primary difference between Islamic psychology and Western psychology.
Jazakallah here, brother. There's quite a few questions which I'm keen to get through before we close, inshallah. A question has come in from one of the participants. It says, can you please explain in a bit more detail the link between balancing the fitra and shaitan's whisperings? Thank you.
One more time, what was the question?
Can you please explain the balance, the detail, the link between balancing the fitra and shaitan's whispering?
I don't understand the question fully. I'm trying to understand, so balancing the fitra with the shaitan's whispers.
So yeah, it says balancing the fitra, the link between balancing the fitra and shaitan's whispering.
So balancing the fitra, I mean, if we speak about, for instance, shaitan's waswas, by working with a client, for instance, or working with ourselves, to be in a state of nafs al-mutma'ina is not easy, because, our nafs is always fluctuating. You could in one moment be in a state of nafs al-mutma'ina, and then you can, go and dwell down into nafs al-mutma'ina, nafs al-amara bil-sul again. So to be mindful of the fluctuating nature of our nafs and try to put yourself in spaces and places which nurtures a fitri way of living your life, that will nurture your nafs to be in a state of nafs al-mutma'ina and strengthen your nafs al-lawama. So you should look at fitri lifestyle as a way of putting you in a space where shaitan doesn't have that strength of affecting you. You understand what I'm saying? If you're in a space where there's a lot of desires and there is a lot of things that are, bringing you away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that brings you into a path of being astray, that will help shaitan, waswas, to be fully exposed to you. By putting yourself in a space or place where this is not as strong, the space is more fitri. And when I speak about space, it's not only a physical space, I'm speaking also about a psychological space for yourself as well. Then the waswas of shaitan will not be as enforced or as strong. So that's why it's so important to work with your character traits, but also to put yourself in a place where virtues, behaviors are more accepted, because we need to have sound companions in our lives that could reflect us and mirror us and how we should live our lifestyle according to Sharia, for instance, right? So as I understand the question, it's important to put yourself in spaces and places which nurtures the fitri aspect of yourself, and that will help you to break the waswas of shaitan and elevate yourself towards coming closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Modernity is not a good place in many ways. It's very difficult, but we cannot isolate ourselves either. So then we need to strengthen our character so that when we go to spaces which is not fitri, we can still manage ourselves. And that's where you work with your character trait, right? You work with tahdib al-akhlaq, refinement of character. You strengthen your strengthen your virtues, and you break your vices. So these spiritual tools that we should internalize, or even, recommend our clients to utilize, are ways for you to be in dunya where you find spaces sometimes that maybe sometimes you need to engage with if you're working or if you're traveling, that is not fitri, but at least you have these toolbox that will break shaitan's waswas so that he cannot allow you to go astray. Shaitan often uses, when you feel imbalanced, he comes with his waswas and uses that moment where you're in balance to make you go astray. And then the whole path is to have these spiritual toolbox so that you can always work with your nafs so that you don't go astray and that shaitan's waswas will not be as forceful. I hope that my answer was helpful, inshallah. Jazakallah khair.
Jazakallah khair. The next question is, thank you very much for that, Brother Jamaluddin. The next question is, what is the most appropriate equivalent word for human emotion in Islamic psychology?
That I think the word will be ihsas. Ihsas means emotion, so ihsas, or ihsas, as they say in Arabic. It's the word used to speak about emotions. So
okay.
ihsas.
Thank you so much. I'm just scrolling through. I know there's a couple of other questions here. Someone has said, can you please throw more light on when a person is possessed by the jinn and psychologically unstable or mental illness?
One more time, if person is...
Can you please throw more light on when a person is possessed by the jinn and psychologically unstable or has mental illness?
I think I would ask this to some of my teachers who work, particularly in those domains. I mean, the whole aspect of, we believe in jinn. We believe in jinn. We believe that, we believe in al-ghaib. We believe in the unseen. We believe in all these things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in the Holy Quran. And when you deal with patients who have mental health issues, some of them ask me sometimes, should I do ruqya as well? I always say, yes, do it. But also come to me. Do both. Do both. It's always good to do ruqya and ask a proper, a proper sheikh who's trained in doing ruqya to do it for you, a raqi. But at the same time, come to a counselor as well. You can do both, The one doesn't exclude the other. Sometimes we don't know, like I cannot see, I cannot know if this is, a possession of a jinn or if this is a mental health issues. Nevertheless, do both, better safe than sound, as they say, because we do believe that, you could find yourself, sometimes could be jinn related issues in a client. And then ruqya is always good. But even if it's not jinn related, it's always good. It's nothing wrong. It's always good. Alhamdulillah. It's a blessing that we have these prescriptions. But then you need to go to a proper person who's trained. So I often tell my clients, do both. Do both. But it doesn't mean that you should just do one of them. Do both. And I guess that's where our advocacy should be. We should not, tell clients to not go to, because there are some, psychologists and Western modalities that are Muslims that, maybe even try to refrain from telling the client to go to a raqi, for instance, and speak about it solely as mental health issues. Well, for me, it's like do both, but come to me as well. And I will work on the mental health aspect. That is my profession. I'm not a raqi. That's not what I do, but you can go to a person who's trained and you can do both. I guess this is a cultural change. We need to advocate for both because many Muslims don't know what an Islamic psychologist is or a psychotherapist is. This is something new in many Muslim countries. And often if they know what it is, then they think that there is a person who's working in Western modalities that are not congruent to Islamic thought. So the whole field of Islamic psychology in this contemporary era is something new. That's why we're so honored to collaborate with your excellent foundation, Sister Aziza, so that in Ghana, for instance, where you guys are working, we can establish ISIP, International Student of Islamic Psychology, as a means of normalizing Islamic psychology. But we adhere to both. We do believe in the metaphysical realities. We do believe in al-ghaib and the unseen. And there are, proper people trained as raqis who should work with ruqya. And what we will do, we will work on other aspect of mental health, which I was alluding to in my presentation. This is the best answer I can give to the question. I personally don't work. I'm not a raqi. Often I tell my clients to go to a raqi or go to a sheikh who is trained if they want ruqya. And allow that to be there for them. It's very important to not denounce it because you're a mental health professional, don't have that almost Western mentality of, denouncing spiritual diseases in that way. That will be my answer. And if you want a more elaborated answer, inshallah, we will bring teachers and scholars who are more, focusing on that, particular domain, and who both are Islamic psychologists and raqis as well. They can also give you perhaps even more elaborated answer of what is the differences. But for me personally, it could be there. It could be there, you know, it could be, you know, even evil eye. These things exist, right? But I do believe that mental health issues could be there as well. So you can work with both. And sometimes a lot of clients who come to us, they are very afraid. They're very afraid. They're in a state of fear. Somebody has, you know, perhaps put lana on me, you know, cursed me, you know, they come with these feelings. And it's for us, it's not to take away that reality, you know, it's more to bring them into a state of peace by telling them, calm down, be in this moment. Because in the end, no matter what happens in that reality, there are tools that could help you to cope and to change and to find yourself in a state of peace once more. So we try to reconnect them to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Some people come to us and they have this view of Allah just being Jalal. And then we try to showcase Allah's Jamali attributes as well, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has both Jamali attributes and Jalali attributes. And some people, they connect to Allah from fear, and we should fear Allah, of course. Taqwa is fearing Allah, but it's not a fear where there's not a love in it, because we fear Allah because we love Him, and He loves us, but we fear Him because we should never take Allah for granted. So it's about bringing the clients into a state of being dynamic and flexible in your thoughts and your behaviors, not to only be governed by fear, but also to be governed by love. But if you're only governed by, no, but Allah will forgive me no matter what, so I don't need to adhere to Sharia, that's also problematic. Then you need to bring the Jalali aspect of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala into the client's domain, right? So we need to bring the client into a state of being flexible. Yes, of course, there is evil eye. There is a reality there. There is jinn. But at the same time, there are ways of dealing with that. Ruqya is one way, but also to ask for mental health support, because the effects of mental health, it's also there for a lot of clients who might also, you know, experience things that are, you know, of metaphysical nature. So do both. I always try to encourage my clients to do both.
Jazakallah khair, brother. I'll move on to the next question. Thank you. It's modern psychology often highlights the personality and how it affects psychological problems. I wonder how Islamic psychology explains personality development and its relation to psychological problems. If possible, please explain a bit.
I think I explained with the notion of fitra as an example.
Yeah, I think
already.
So. Yeah, absolutely.
And that notion is quite interesting to look at. There is a very good book of fitra. Professor Yassin Muhammad, a South African scholar, one of the leading scholars in Islamic psychology, he wrote a book about fitra. It's actually, I think it's accessible for free online. Inshallah, before the session is over, I will add my WhatsApp number, even though it's not working right now, but you can write to me in a couple of days. And I will also add my email address. So for those who are interested, you just email me or write me on WhatsApp within a couple of days, and I'm happy to give you access to those resources. And we will also speak a little bit about how to become active in ISIP before we end the session. But that book speaks about fitra. There's also another book. I forgot the name of the book. Let me see. I have it here. Just one second. So The Lives of Man by Imam al-Haddad, where he speaks about let me show you the book here. It's a very good book. So The Lives of Man by Imam al-Haddad, a guide to the human states before life and the world and after death. And what Imam Haddad speaks about in this book is, you know, our development cycle from before we were born, like born into dunya, and then what happens throughout dunya and afterlife, after death. So there are a lot of great, you know, scholars who've been writing about development from different components. And inshallah, we can share these resources with all of you, inshallah. And what I spoke about fitra is part of that.
The next question is, Jazakallah khair, brother. It says, I would like to train as a counselor, psychotherapist in Ireland. Which Western psychological approach can be used best in line with Islamic psychology? I'm vacillating between a master's in CBT or integrative psychotherapy.
I think, you know, all modalities could essentially be used. As I mentioned, there is wisdom in all modalities, right? So in a sense, you could be trained in whatever modality, as long as you're very mindful to what aspects of that modality is applicable to the Islamic paradigm and what is not. That's the first paradigm. And that's exactly when I was presenting about Islamization of knowledge, that's what Al-Faruqi, Al-Atas, and Najati spoke about when it came to Islamization of knowledge too. Like Al-Atas spoke about isolation process. Isolate those part of that knowledge construct that is applicable, and then leave the rest. So for the sister from, or brother, I don't know if it's sister, brother, I would love to, if you can tell their names as well, Sister Aziz,
Okay,
I can just say salam to all of them.
Okay.
I would appreciate it. So for the person in Ireland,
it's Sister Zita. Yeah.
Zita. So look at what you're interested in yourself, first and foremost, but always think about isolation. Take the things and utilize the things that are applicable and refrain from the things that are not applicable. Then, of course, there are some notions in modern psychology that are more, congruent, as I mentioned in my presentation: positive psychology, third wave CBT. I really recommend acceptance and commitment therapy. It's a beautiful modality that you can train yourself in. Also logotherapy, which is a meaning-based narrative therapy. It's about finding meaning in, for instance, trauma. It's a very beautiful modality. It was established by a Jewish survivor of the Holocaust. His name was Viktor Frankl. He survived Auschwitz. I think it was Auschwitz. He survived the Holocaust. And he became an advocate of something he called logotherapy, to find meaning in trauma. It's very applicable to Islamic paradigm, to find meaning in what you're going through. And we can utilize the stories of the prophets. A lot of the prophets went through a lot of hardship, right? A lot of trials, right? And they never lost their hope and their belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So there's a lot of modalities that you can utilize that is very congruent. And if you have more questions, I'm happy to be at your service. We would like to establish ISIP's Irish chapter. So if you're interested, sister, you can be part of that as well. So just connect yourself with us, and I will share my details as well, and join our WhatsApp groups that we're sharing in the Zoom chat. And we're happy to help you with the resources we have and which type of educations that could be a benefit for you as you want to integrate Islamic psychology as well in your clinical practice. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant you tawfiq, inshallah.
Ameen. Brother, there's a couple of more questions which I want to do before we wrap up in the last few minutes. It says, is NLP, neuro-linguistic programming, rooted in Islamic psychology? If not, how can it be integrated into Islamic psychology?
I'm not that knowledgeable in NLP, but when I spoke with some of my teachers, majority says that NLP is not applicable to Islamic paradigm, as I have heard. But I want to say Allahu Alam. I don't know a lot about NLP, so I can't have any views on it. I'm just referring to some of my teachers' views, and I trust my teachers. It's very important, brothers and sisters, to have a strong relationship to a silsila of knowledge, to a chain of knowledge. So that, because everything that I was speaking about today comes from a chain of knowledge. And this chain of knowledge goes back to the Prophet ﷺ, but also I studied from the silsila of Professor Malik Badri, rahimahullah, because I did my postgraduate diploma in Islamic psychology in Cambridge Muslim College. And Professor Badri, with Dr. Rotman, they established this program. So it's important for you to always have that connection to a solid chain of knowledge. And when it comes to dealing with different modalities in Western psychology, some of them I can give you an answer to because I know them. Some of them I don't know. NLP, I heard about it. I'm not knowledgeable in it. But from what I have spoken with some of my teachers, and also from colleagues that are trained in NLP or at least studied NLP, some are saying that you can utilize it, but many are also very critical. So when you engage with so let me give you a general answer, all right? And I can't answer NLP, but I heard that it's not applicable. That's what I heard, but I put Allah Alam there because I'm not knowledgeable in NLP. But generally, listen to what Al-Faruqi says in Islamization of knowledge. Don't try to advocate for Islamic NLP. Like even CBT, some people call it Islamic CBT. Allahu Alam. We can use that word. It's better to, instead just being honest, said, these are some tools from CBT that is congruent to Islamic paradigm. That's better to say, because now CBT is quite applicable to Islamic paradigm. But let's say, for instance, psychodynamic therapy. I'm trained in PDT. Okay? I'm trained in PDT. I wouldn't say this is Islamic PDT. It's not, I would rather say there are some tools in PDT that are applicable to Islamic paradigm. Because we need to be very mindful. We cannot, you know, market the thing without being fully mindful if it's Islamic or not. You understand what I'm saying? Like when our traditional scholars were studying the science of the soul, they were also studying other traditions, you know, knowledge like Greek philosophy, ancient Persian philosophy, etc. But they never portrayed Greek philosophy as Islamic philosophy. They never said this is Islamic philosophy. Like they never call it Plato, Islamic Plato philosophy or Islamic Aristotle philosophy. They never convey it like that. They were just, you know, studying because they were curious, and some of the notions that they find applicable to Islamic paradigm they utilized, and they also explained where they derived it from and how it's applicable, etc. That will be my nasiyah to you when you engage with other, you know, interventions that are not from the Islamic tradition, and then ask people that are educated, people that are scholars, and also trained in psychology and also rooted in Islamic psychology. Even there, maybe some people don't have knowledge about NLP, and always be critical. Always be critical. Have a critical mindset, but also remember that wisdom is the lost believer. Wisdom is the lost property of the believer. So we can with curiosity engage in other traditions, but being very mindful and sensitive. And don't mark Islamic psychology is not to market CBT as Islamic. I'm Islamic psychologist, I do Islamic CBT. No, that's not Islamic psychology, but you can utilize it in Islamic psychology from a top-down approach. It's a very complex answer to a complex question, but I do believe in multiplexity as long as it's rooted in the Quran and Sunnah. With regards to NLP, I heard that it's not applicable. That's what I heard.
Thank you so much, brother. The last question before we wrap up, it's how can I distinguish from Sufi ideologies when understanding Islamic psychology, especially since many models are based in Sufi traditions?
I don't understand that question.
Yeah, it says, how can I distinguish from Sufi ideologies when understanding Islamic psychology?
Islamic psychology is, as I mentioned, it's an interdisciplinary field where scholars from different tradition provided, knowledge to understand the soul and the reality of the soul and the structure of the soul and the level of the soul. So you have scholars, for instance, from the Tasawwuf tradition who contributed, and also from the Tib tradition, and also from the Akhlaq tradition, and many other traditions as well. So the interdisciplinary nature is there, and Tasawwuf was part of it, but there were other traditions and other disciplines as well that contributed. And that's what distinguished Islamic psychology would only like, let's say, studying one of the disciplines, whether it's Akhlaq or Tasawwuf or Tib or Falsafa or Kalam. Islamic psychology is interdisciplinary. So you have from the fiqh tradition scholars who studied psychology from the fiqh tradition or from the Tasawwuf tradition or from the Kalam tradition or from the Akhlaq or Tib tradition. So that's what distinguishes Islamic psychology. It's not only unidisciplinary, it's interdisciplinary. So by working or studying Islamic psychology, you're not only studying, for instance, Tasawwuf, because the person is speaking about Tasawwuf and Sufism. You did study fiqh. You studied, you need to study fiqh, Tib, Kalam, Akhlaq, etc. So it's very interdisciplinary in its nature. And then, of course, there are different approaches into modern psychology. In different countries, different approaches are advocated. So, for instance, in some countries is less Tasawwuf oriented, and some countries is more Tasawwuf oriented because of, which madhabs are, common in that context. For instance, you can, for instance, compare Turkey or Turkiya with, let's say, the Khalij countries. And there is a little bit different approaches when it comes to Islamic psychology. In Turkiya, it's very much, Tasawwuf tradition is integral in the study of the soul, together with other traditions. In Khalij countries, it's less integral due to different, adherence. And we as ISIP, the International Student of Islamic Psychology, we don't advocate one model. We try to show the buffet of different approaches. And then you, as a student, as a mental health professional, you can choose which modality that is most congruent to your way or your approach or your worldview. It's up to you to decide. We showcase all types of approaches as long as they're rooted in the Quran and the Sunnah. So that is what we use as a furqan, as a measurement, Quran and Sunnah. But within that, there's different approaches. Even the traditional scholars had different approaches. Ibn Sina advocated some theories, and Imam Ghazali other, Ibn Taymiyyah other, Ibn al-Hazm other, Ibn Miskawayh other. So they had different approaches as well, but they all worked interdisciplinary, and the whole field is interdisciplinary in that sense, if you know what I'm saying. So there are different modalities, and there are different approaches. There are top-down approaches, bottom-up approaches, indigenous approaches. But tasawwuf was one of the disciplines that developed the study of the nafs, and it's historically been integral, and it's one of the main bodies of knowledge in the historical development of Islamic psychology. But today you have different approaches, and you can use the approach that is most compatible to your worldview. In ISIP, we do not take any stance. We try to showcase different approaches. We have colleagues that are oriented towards different approaches, and we respect all approaches as long as it's rooted in the Quran and the Sunnah. But we try to not advocate or even say that my approach is better than your approach. We don't believe in that. We believe that Islam is a multiplex religion in the sense that unity comes from adhering to the Quran and Sunnah. That's what unites us. But then there are different ways of understanding fiqh. That's why we have 4 madahib in Ahl al-Sunnah, right? There are different ways of understanding psychological interventions. And as I mentioned, in different countries, they could be less tasawwuf oriented or more tasawwuf oriented according to which madhab or which perspectives are, mostly rooted. And this is the way that we look at it, that we try to highlight all approaches and also to highlight the interdisciplinary nature of Islamic psychology. Islamic psychology is not only fiqh, it's not only tib, it's not only kalam or akhlaq or tasawwuf, it's all of them together. And tasawwuf is part of it, akhlaq is part of it, tib is part of it. But then different approaches have less or more of certain discipline. And then there is a top-down approach as well towards Islamic psychology. I hope that will make sense for you guys.
Jazakallah khair, Brother Jamaluddin. That was excellent. Just before we wrap up, I thought I would just read some really positive comments from people saying that this has been wonderful and very reassuring to learn about how IP represents the coexistence and complementarity of modern psychology, spirituality, Islamic traditions, and faith healing. As other people have said, fantastic, alhamdulillah, they're tuning in from Turkey. May Allah reward your effort. Whereas Muslim academicians in psychology, glad to follow you from Turkey. So we're having a lot of people from different parts of the world, West Africa, Asia, Europe, just tuning in and also, adding their comments. We have an NLP comment from Habiba Balogu, who has studied NLP extensively, and she said, NLP is the study and modeling of successful methods. It does not concern itself so much with the underpinning of a successful behavioral approach. For example, how did the most successful psychologists think, see the world, and communicate? The words and phrasings they used, why they are the way that way is not explored, their deep-rooted belief systems, etc. It rests on some universal secular principles about mental models. That is about it. It can be very powerful, but I don't think it is aligned with the state of fitra, etc. in IP. My opinion based on what I've learned till today. Thank you so much, Mrs. Balogu. And I would like to say Jazakallah khair so much to you, brother, for your time. It's been a really wonderful, enlightening session. I would like to say to everybody that we have established the ISIP chapter in Ghana, and I think the link to the WhatsApp group has been set up, has been posted on this platform. You can also email the Emmoa email if you want to get more information about the ISIP chapter in Ghana. Basically, somebody was asking on the platform, it's going to be a general platform for discussion and also posting events and access to resources and materials. There's also ISIP in different jurisdictions all over the world, and they're constantly actually expanding their chapters, like Brother Jamaluddin was mentioning. They want to set up in Ireland, so if the sister from Ireland can contact Brother Jamaluddin. And it's really a global movement, and it's really a wonderful movement, and it's about learning and sharing and growing, and also ensuring that we have quite a few Islamic psychologists or psychologists that we've identified in West Africa, but obviously a lot of people want and need more training in specific Islamic psychology, so they need that as well. So that's something that I know ISIP is also looking at in the future. Brother Jamaluddin has very kindly put his number in there for people who want to WhatsApp him directly with queries, etc., and also his email. So thank you so much for that, brother. And if you have any closing remarks and du'as, that would be very much appreciated. Thank you so much.
Jazakallah khairan, Sister Aziza. It's been such an honor to be with you. I want to first and foremost ask for forgiveness for even my answers, because in the end, I'm sure you guys know that there is not one answer to all questions. There are, we need to sometimes be in the state of multiplexity. And, the only thing that I know for sure that we can all unite is that it needs to be rooted in the Quran and the Sunnah. This is what all the scholars united in. And then they have different, reflections apart with regards to different ways of understanding the realities and also, doing interventions. So we need to adhere to this multiplex nature of our culture, of our tradition, and at the same time unite ourselves by rooting ourselves in the Quran and the Sunnah. As your fellow colleague, I want to ask for forgiveness for any shortcomings in my presentation and in my answers. Please forgive me, and please make dua for me and for the whole ISIP. We're a very, young movement, but very energetic movement, and it's just really a blessing to be with so many colleagues all over the world. I could never dream of connecting with colleagues in Ghana. And West Africa is actually such a rich place when it comes to historical contribution to Islamic psychology. So I would love to do more lectures in ISIP Ghana and ISIP West Africa, but the West African contribution to the field of Islamic psychology, historically and in the contemporary era, whether it's from Ghana, Nigeria, Gambia, Mali, Senegal, etc. So to all my fellow brothers and sisters from West Africa and Ghana, it's such an honor to be with all of you. And you guys have such a beautiful history in Islamic thought and Islamic psychology that I would love to learn more about, inshallah. And the manuscripts that I read has been truly a blessing. I also want to thank all participants from all over the world for joining us. Feel free to join our resource sharing groups for Islamic psychology. My colleague, Sister Ismat, she will share the link again. Sister Ismat, if you can share the Islamic psychology link as well. There you can find resources about Islamic psychology and Muslim mental health. Feel free to join our lectures and halaqas that we do in different languages. And we're going to do a lot of initiatives in Ghana under the excellent leadership of Sister Aziza and the rest of our excellent team. So I want to thank all the organizers today. I want to thank all the participants. I also added, as Sister Aziza said, my email address and my WhatsApp number. My WhatsApp is not functioning right now, so maybe you can write to me in a week, then I can see it. But for now, you can also email me if there is anything, and we will email out the recordings and all the resources you need to all of those who registered. So if you haven't registered to the lecture, please register yourself and you will get an email with all the things that you need, maybe the recordings or other resources that will be beneficial for you, inshallah. All right, I will end by, I don't think, is it anything else you want to say, Sister? Should we speak more about ISIP Ghana, or I think that's clear enough, right? That we're going to start the Ghanaian chapter.
I think it's clear enough. I think there's some people posting about trainings and things, but they'll probably email directly. I think maybe just mention a little bit about future intentions of training, because I think that's something in the West African region.
Oh, that's good to know.
A lot of the psychologists or people who are working with nurses or other they're very interested in training, and I think it'd be good to give them some guidance on that.
Of course. Assalamu alaikum, Imam. Imam Abbas is from Ghana. MashaAllah. Nice to speak to you, Sheikhna. So there are some initiatives going on. We're planning to do a pilot project, inshallah, in Ghana with Sister Aziza and the rest of her excellent team. So we're planning to do a pilot project with ISIP Ghana and the Emmoa Foundation about training people in the basics of Islamic psychology, or at least giving an introduction to it, both both theoretically and also application-wise. To tell you the truth, this is nothing that you can just learn in 5 days, but at least you can get a taste of it. And then we will also recommend you to do programs in different universities and institutions that are offering it as well. We're going to establish some curriculums and programs also in our research center, Al-Balkhi Institute, in the future. But I would recommend you guys to visit ISIP's website, actually. Let me add that also, where you can see all the universities, institutions, and organizations that are offering programs or courses in Islamic psychology. We have highlighted those that we know about, which is like 40 organizations and universities. But we're planning to do a form of a crash workshop, inshallah, in the near future, for mental health professionals and for religious leaders as well, because I do believe that we need to work interdisciplinary and invite our religious leaders and imams to be part of this, because what differentiates what an Islamic psychologist does with the imam is that the imam works on the higher level, or the imam works mainly on the spiritual aspect, even though a lot of imams are also actually counselors in many ways, right? You're dealing with a lot of questions from your congregation with regards to questions that are perhaps mental health related as well. What we try to do is to always differentiate ourselves from the imams by saying, I'm not a faqih. If you want fiqh-related answer, please go to an imam. What I work with is mental health from an Islamic psychological and Muslim mental health point of view. That's how we differentiate, right? But then the way that we can work together, Imam, is by understanding our differences in our professions and collaborating. I have my own, colleagues that are imams that I always consult with when it comes to certain questions that some of my clients are raising in the, in my sessions that are beyond my scope, right? And then I, either consult with my colleagues or I refer them to my colleagues that are imams. So we want to invite the imams to be part of understanding the Islamic psychology discipline, but also the profession of being a mental health practitioner. And at the same time, we would love to know more about the imams' work on a daily basis and then how we can work together. We're also establishing a task force in ISIP, which we call fiqh and counseling. We're trying to invite both imams and mental health professionals to work together for the benefit of the health of the Muslim and the Muslimah. How can we understand the intersection between fiqh and Islamic psychology and counseling? How can we understand the intersection between being a spiritual leader and a mental health professional and working together? How can we utilize each other's knowledge? Because we have complementary roles. This is quite interesting. If you look at the Christian tradition, they have their priests and they have their chaplains. Their chaplains are kind of like Christian teachers or Christian pedagogues. And the priest is a spiritual leader in their congregation and the Christian communities. We as Muslims, we don't have any chaplains per se. I know that in UK they have Muslim chaplaincy, but it's still not Muslim. Like chaplaincy in itself comes from the Christian tradition. But what we as Muslims can do is to look at our tradition and see how can we complement, let's say, an imam or a sheikh or a mashayikh with a counselor that is trained in Islamic psychology. So in my training, we are called rafiqs, companions. So I am a companion. I'm a rafiq towards my clients. And an imam is an imam. So maybe we should find a way of working imams and rafiqs or rafiqas together. And that will be the term of how it is to be an Islamic psychologist. That is the term. I am a rafiq, I'm an Islamic psychologist. So this is something that we're exploring as we speak right now, dear excellent scholars, brothers and sisters. And we're trying to find the proper terminology rooted in our tradition. And if we don't find it in our tradition, what type of terminologies will be applicable to the Islamic paradigm that we could utilize? So there are Muslim chaplains, and they are doing an amazing job. And you find a lot of chaplaincy in UK, US, and Canada. And I'm a big advocate for that. So that could be a terminology. Maybe we can find another terminology in our tradition as well as a complementary terminology. It could be being a khadam or being a rafiq, which you can find in our tradition. Rafiq, particularly, you can find Imam Ghazali spoke about seeking a rafiq's help. If you don't have a sheikh close by that is a righteous scholar, then seek a righteous companion's help if you're dealing with different issues in life, for instance. So we're going to do trainings. We're going to announce it in all of our WhatsApp groups and all of our social media and our newsletter. So feel free to become a member of ISIP and join our newsletter, and we will inform. And Ghana and West Africa, we will do these two, Ghana as a country and West Africa as a region, as the pilot region of doing this type of workshops and programs in the basics of Islamic psychology and psychotherapy in the near future, inshallah. That will be our niyyah. The last thing I want to say, we have a lot of colleagues from Turkey and Ireland. So ISIP has a Turkish chapter. Turkey is one of the leading countries in the scholarship in the field of Islamic psychology. You guys are doing an amazing job. And many of the leading scholars are from Turkey as well. So we have a Turkish chapter, and we have some of the leading scholars from Turkey, part of our Turkish chapter. So for the sisters and brothers who are from Turkey, feel free to join our Turkish chapter. We want to establish our UK chapter as well. So for the sister or brothers from UK, feel free to email me or WhatsApp me or join our WhatsApp groups. and we will be in touch with you guys, inshallah. Jazakallah khairan, everyone. I wish you all a great continuation of the day. So we will end by just doing a dua in English, inshallah. Sister Aziza, I mentioned everything, right? I didn't forget
mentioned everything. I'm going to say something quickly because before you do dua. So once you've done the dua, we will close, inshallah. Someone was asking about the Nigerian chapter. There is a Nigerian chapter. So I don't know if you can put them in. It was somebody from Nigeria. There has a Nigerian chapter has been established. Correct, brother?
Yes, we have a Nigerian chapter, which is part of the West African chapter. So I saw here Dr. Tawfiq, an honor to speak with you, Dr. Tawfiq.
Yeah.
So if you join Sister Ismail, could you share the West African WhatsApp group as well, Sister Ismail? Join that group. And Sister Aziza, have you registered? Do we have the emails of all those who attended the lecture today?
Yes, we have all those who registered. Yeah, have. And if they didn't register for some reason, I've just put the Emmoa email for them to send their email address so that we can make sure they get the recording. They get all the recording of this session if they want to play it back, because some people are complaining that they're in America and they've only just logged in, and the time I put in GMT, Ghana is GMT, and then I put in West Africa, which is Nigeria. So I kind of put, but some people I think said, can we list all the time? So and fair enough, we're living in a globalized world. I will list all the kind of main global timings in the future. Thank you for that, brother, and I'm sorry you missed some of it, but the recording will be circulated. So just email Emmoa Foundation, and once the recording is ready, you will receive it, inshallah.
Inshallah, we will add it. I mean, you guys will add it, and with your permission, maybe we can add it in our YouTube channel as well, so everybody can benefit from. So we will, inshallah, share all these things. We're in a very deep partnership with Emmoa Foundation. I want to thank Sister Aziza and her team. They're doing an amazing job. So feel free to follow their excellent work as well. And we're going to, so the Ghanaian chapter is established with the help of Emmoa Foundation, and we will establish ISIP's chapter in partnership with them in Ghana. West African chapter, we have a lot of Nigerians, Ustad Tawfiq. So feel free to join the Nigerian chapter, West African chapter. I asked Sister Ismat, but I don't find her in the chat. She's not with us anymore. So you know what, brother? Join the Ghanaian WhatsApp group, and we will share the Nigerian WhatsApp group, West African WhatsApp group there as well. And yes, we have a lot of plans in West Africa, in Nigeria, in Ghana, and other West African countries as well, inshallah. We're putting a lot of time to establish our infrastructure in West Africa, because sometimes when we speak about the Muslim world, we tend to forget about West Africa. Unfortunately, this is a shame, in all honesty. This is a shame. And we as Muslims need to be self-critical on that. West Africa is the core part of the Ummah. And we have such a rich tradition in Islamic psychology in your beautiful region and country. So we're very delighted to be supporting you guys and creating and establishing ISIP chapter. And when it comes to curriculum, brother, Dr. Tawfiq, actually we have Professor Allahumma salli ala Muhammad, Professor Salihu. Professor Salihu is part of ISIP's advisory board. He's one of the leading scholars in Islamic psychology from Nigeria, and we're planning to do a lot of initiatives with him. And that part of that is also to work with curriculum development. And we're planning to do some curriculum development as well, and highlighting all the different curriculums that you can find in different universities when it comes to training yourself or studying Islamic psychology. We will try to learn from all these curriculums as well, and try to find a way to do like a meta-analysis and utilizing knowledge from all these curriculums, and also establishing our own curriculums together with mental health professional and Islamic psychology scholars as well. So there's a lot of things going on, and we would love to have you with us, Dr. Tawfiq. It will be an honor to work with you and your school, inshallah. That will be such an honor. Jazakallah khairan. Oh, okay, Dr. Tawfiq. Professor Salisu is your mentor. Yes, exactly. We actually had Professor Salisu doing our introduction lecture in ISIP West Africa 3 weeks ago, if I'm not mistaken. He's an excellent scholar. So you're in good hands. You're in good hands. Professor Salisu is an amazing scholar. I consider him my own teacher as well, by the way. So subhanallah, it was an honor to host him, and we did a lecture. He did a lecture, I did a presentation, the similar presentation as I did today. So you guys have both contemporary scholars that are, mashallah, very knowledgeable, and of course you have a historical tradition as well when it comes to ilm al-nafs. We will be in touch, Dr. Tawfiq. Please feel free to take my number, write to me, or email me, inshallah. All right, shall we end by doing a dua perhaps? All right. So I will do it in English, inshallah, as we have an international audience. And feel free once more to connect with us. And it's such an honor to have an international movement present today, honestly. We have from Turkey here, Ireland, Ghana, Nigeria, Saudi Arabia, Indonesia, Malaysia. MashaAllah, all these countries are doing an amazing job. We have a lot of great scholars from Indonesia, from Saudi Arabia, doing an amazing job, advocating for different approaches in IP, which is amazing. May Allah grant all of you tawfiq, my dear brothers and sisters. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept all of our intentions to normalize Islamic psychology all over the world, to purify our intentions. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, may you purify our intentions so that we don't govern our initiatives from our nafs al-amara rather than nafs al-mutma'ina. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, may you purify our soul, purify our metaphysical heart so that we do this job and do these approaches for the sake of pleasing you and nobody else than you, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give relief to all of our brothers and sisters all over the world who are struggling with different trials and tribulations in life, and make these trials and tribulations and as a means of purification for them so that they can come closer to you, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us shifa and healing as you the source of healing and nobody else than you are source of the healing. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala help us to decolonialize our mind state so that we can reconnect to our fitri psychology, to our fitra and to our ilm al-nafs. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, do not make us of those who are reacting towards others rather than we take actions instead, that we learn from others but not to disregard our own tradition. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala help us to root ourselves in our own tradition once more and to decolonialize. We don't mean that we should not learn from other traditions, rather we should root ourselves in our tradition and learn from that how to be curious without losing track. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala connect all of our brothers and sisters from all over the world, West Africa, the whole African continent, Middle East, Southeast Asia, Europe, South America, North America, Australia, and Oceania, so that we together can create a digital ummah where we once more break the stigma of how to deal with mental health. Because those who are tested by you, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we know that you love those that you test most. You love those, you're testing them because you love them. So we shouldn't stigmatize your servants that are going to mental health crisis or issues. Rather, we should see them as those that are most beloved. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, allow us to have both the dunyavi and the ukhravi approach when it comes to mental health, to not stigmatize those that are advocating for spiritual notions of psychology. Rather, we embrace them and we give them love and appreciation. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala help us to break the allopathic medicine in West and allow us to introduce Islamic psychology as also empirical field and study. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we ask you to purify all of us and to connect all of us and to grant all of us success and tawfiq both in dunya and in akhirah, inshallah. Al-Fatiha. Jazakallah khairan, dear brothers and sisters. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept this dua for all of us, inshallah. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept all of your duas. I wish you all a great continuation of your day and we stay in touch. Looking forward to connect with all of you. And if you have any interest of starting local chapters in your own countries and region, we will be at your service. That will be such an honor. So please do connect with us then. And if you need any more lectures or introductions, I'm happy to be at your service. So just connect us and I'm happy to be at your service. And we will also connect you with other excellent scholars and practitioners as well. I wish you all a great day. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Sister Aziza, thank you so much for today. An honor to be with you. You've done an amazing job as a host. Thank you for hosting me.
Assalamu alaikum and jazakallah khair to everybody for joining. Take care. Assalamu alaikum. Have a lovely day. We'll be in touch. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.